Good morning and welcome. My name is Marissa Reckman, CEO of AGAT Labs. And today it is truly my honor to introduce to you a presentation that is so important, not just on today, November 11th, but on every day. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Warrant Officer Tex Leugner to the podium. Please join me in offering your sincere welcome.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here today to do a presentation on Canada's military history and why it's so important to remember Remembrance Day and what it means to Canada. I want to read a paragraph here. Canadian soldiers have fought to preserve freedom and democracy from the Boer War to Afghanistan. Perhaps the most savage was World War I, which claimed over 61,000 casualties at the Battle of the Somme, Ypres, Passchendaele, Vimy Ridge, and many others. This was trench warfare at its worst, in which soldiers lived in the mud and the blood with rats and filth and suffered casualties not only from bombs and bullets, but from terrible gas attacks. The Battle of the Somme, in particular, was one of the most brutal. The Battle of Vimy Ridge was the battle that gave Canada its pride of nationhood. Canadian soldiers took the ridge after both the English and the French had failed. And you can see the area here where the arrows are pointing to the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Vimy. The picture on the left shows you the kinds of conditions that our soldiers lived in during that terrible war. The defense of Hong Kong. The Battle of Hong Kong was a tragedy as the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Quebec numbered 1,964 soldiers were sent to support the British defenders of the island. The Japanese attacked in overwhelming numbers on the 8th of December 1941. By Christmas Day, the Japanese had overrun the Canadians and Brits, with Canadian casualties of over 50% killed or wounded. Another 264 Canadians would die as Japanese prisoners of war. And here you see a photograph of Canadian and British prisoners awaiting liberation by landing from HMCS. I'm not sure what the ship was, but they were brought home at that time. The Dieppe raid in 1942. On the 19th of August 1942, Allied commanders carried out the Dieppe raid, an attack on the Germans on the French coast at Pourville and Pau, led by 3,350 Canadians. As a result of the loss of surprise, the attack failed, costing Canada 916 killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The Dieppe raid has long been criticized as a costly mistake. I suggest that it was extremely valuable in learning what not to do during the planning of the Normandy invasion, which came later. During my own service with NATO forces in Europe, I attended the 25th anniversary of the raid. It was clear to me that our soldiers couldn't possibly overcome the problem of the sheer cliffs on either side of the landing sites, making a successful attack on the town of Dieppe next to impossible. We'll now witness a video of the Dieppe raid.
It's a cool summer morning here, a little different from the way it was 25 years ago, when by full daylight the Dieppe raid had already turned into one of the major military disasters of the Second World War. Gathered to remember that occasion and honor the 907 Canadians who died at Dieppe are the survivors of the raid and the relatives of the dead. The survivors include representatives of the 12 Canadian regiments which took part in the raid. Among them the Royal Regiment of Canada, which in a few hours at Dieppe suffered the heaviest death toll of any Canadian battalion during the whole course of the Second World War. August 19, 1942, Churchill in his memoirs called it a day all its own in the long history of war. Was the Dieppe raid, as some claim, a bloodletting that should never have been launched in the first place, or did the lessons learned at Dieppe enable greater losses to be prevented at the D-Day landings in Normandy 2 years later? What is certain is that the raid brought more than a gleam of hope to Nazi-occupied France and Europe. It was the proof that Canadians were prepared to die for the liberation, a pledge they'd come back later to help the Allies finish the task. David Holton, CBC News, Dieppe.
The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 was a prelude to a complete and full attack on Fortress Europe, a back door to defeating the Germans. Opposition was light on Sicily, but after the Canadians crossed the Strait of Messina and landed on the Italian boot, things got much tougher. During battles at Ortona, Casa Berardi, Monte Cassino, San Ferdinando, the Gothic Line, and others, Canadian soldiers made themselves proud. A particular issue was the Battle of Anzio, where the 1st Special Service Force, a combined force of highly trained airborne Canadian and American soldiers known as the Devil's Brigade, distinguished themselves, later honored by the American Congress for their heroism. Finally, Rome was taken and the Allies had won the Italian campaign. 72,757 Canadians served in Italy, with less than 5,500 killed and almost 20,000 wounded. Next, we have a soldier from the Royal Canadian Electromechanical Engineers who fought during the Battle of Italy. He's 98 years of age, and he covered our motto. The motto of our Corps is Arti e Marti, meaning by skill and by fighting. Mr. Nicholson was a mechanic, and not only did he repair tanks, but he was actually seconded to take part in a battle by driving one. So he fit our motto completely. D-Day and the Battle of Normandy. After brutal fighting, Operation Overlord, for which the Normandy invasion was named, was a success, with the 1st Canadian Army landing at Juno Beach. The tough part was yet to be accomplished. Liberating Europe was still ahead. After battles at Caen, La Falaise Gap, Berniers, Courseulles, Boulogne, the Canadians entered Holland. After tough battles at the Scheldt, the Breskens Pocket, and the Walcheren Causeway, the liberation of Holland was a Canadian success. Next, the Canadians fought the Battle of Rhineland, the Hochwald Gap. They crossed the Rhine and Hitler's war was over. There's a video now that you can witness here.
Well, this is in a landing craft assault. Usually about 36 men in there, or maybe a little bit less, because they always like to keep, you have 10 men in a section, they always like to keep 2 out of battle to come in as reinforcements later for take the place of casualties. And this is an actual shot of them going in. I think it's where the the 8th Brigade went in near Bernier-sur-Mer. And you can see they were all set. There'd be some on the beach landing party. Also be somebody else with some identification signs and the what they call a beach landing party. So they stick those in the sand so the other boats could see the sign and make sure they're landing in the right place. But these are the infantry people going in, and you can see they're all pretty anxious, right? And there's a middle group go out first. There's the hedgehogs there. Yeah, there's the hedgehogs, and there's a ladder for climbing over. Now what they actually done is on each of the landing craft they put a camera with a wire going back to a battery, and the sailor was supposed to turn it on, but the seawater fouled it up. I can't really recall, but it was rough as you got near the shore. You'd see that he's quite a ways away from there. And there's a guy carrying a signal set. This may have been the follow-up group. It could have been the initial one or the follow-up group. See, either everybody had a shovel or they had a pick. There's one pick for every 5 men, and then everybody had a shovel. And then they used to have what they call an entrenching shovel, but it was no good, so everybody was issued a spade. No, this looks like this almost a dry landing because it's only knee deep, right?
Okay.
So it's where we landed, like I say, I'd landed in the water about 8 or 9 feet deep. I had to swim in. So it was 8 or 9 including the waves, so on. It was pretty rough.
I want to show a couple of our World War II veterans who fought during the battle across Europe and eventually liberating Holland. This is Mr. Bill Ward. He lives in Airdrie, Alberta. He's 100 years of age. I met this old gentleman when he was awarded a Quilt of Valor, just immediately after his 100th birthday. This next gentleman is Lance Corporal Peter Pouquet, 99 years of age. He lives in Lethbridge now. And of course, he's got the French right here, the French award for heroism because he fought across France, of course, with all of our Canadians, but he was particularly honored with that particular badge from France, or with that medal from France. The liberation of the Netherlands, as you can see, the arrow points out the headquarters of the 1st Canadian Army, and of course, the Canadians liberated Holland. And the gentleman that I showed you a picture of just a moment ago, he visited Holland when he was 85 years old with his family, and he was treated like a king. They fed him, he couldn't buy a drink, his hotel rooms were paid for, and he was treated like a hero. Here we see Dutch civilians and Canadian Army troops celebrating the liberation on the 7th of May, 1945 in Utrecht in Holland. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953. Known as the Forgotten War, for which a peace treaty has never been concluded, Canada fought with the American forces to ensure that the Soviet-backed North Koreans would not take South Korea. The war went on from 50 to 1953, after which a United Nations peacekeeping observer force was put into place until 1957. A total of 516 Canadians died during the Korean War, including 46 peacekeepers. Obviously, there was no peace to keep. The Battle of Kapyong is remembered by the 2nd Battalion PPCLI. And you can see in the screen the area of Kapyong, just next to Seoul, where if the PPCLI had not helped stop the North Koreans at the Battle of Kapyong, South Korea would have been lost to North Korea. And here we see some of the equipment that was used during the Korean War. There's an illustration of the Battle of Cap Yong again, the arrow. And what we see is the Chinese and the North Koreans actually almost took the entire island. They were driven back by the Americans and Canadians. And then, of course, had they not been stopped at Cap Yong, they may have taken the entire peninsula.
Following Japan's surrender at the conclusion of the Second World War, Korea is occupied by the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union holds the territory north of the 38th parallel, and the United States remains south of the line. Both interim governments intend for the two halves to reunify, but ideological differences complicate the process. In June 1950, following border clashes, the North Korean People's Army, using Chinese and Soviet-supplied weapons, invade the Southern Republic of Korea in an attempt to reunite the country by force. The United Nations Security Council condemns the invasion and urges members of the General Assembly to give military support to the Republic of Korea. More than 20 allied nations, including Canada, do so in late June 1950. Initial combat occurs across the Korean peninsula, but by 1951 the armies are engaged in a defensive war of patrols and raids along the 38th parallel. The Allied forces are unprepared for the guerrilla tactics used by the opposing North Korean and Chinese infantries. However, Canadian troops distinguished themselves during the close combat battles of Cap Yong and Hill 355. Canada also sends air and naval support, protecting UN aircraft carriers, delivering personnel and supplies, and assisting with onshore operations. The war drags on until July 27, 1953, when the opposing forces sign the Korean Armistice Agreement. The Korean Demilitarized Zone, known as the DMZ, and a ceasefire are established, and prisoners of war are exchanged. The cooling of hostilities is meant to allow for the negotiation of a peace settlement, but that has not been reached to this day. Canadian forces serve in South Korea until 1957, tasked with maintaining the peace. The Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War due to the lack of public attention it received both during and after. Over the 7 years Canadians serve in Korea, 516 Canadian soldiers lose their lives, and more than 1,200 are wounded.
There's no such thing as peacekeeping when there's no peace to keep. As I mentioned earlier, we lost 46 peacekeepers during peacekeeping operations in Korea after the war. I want to talk a little bit about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was created in 1949 to provide collective security against the Soviet Union. Canada played a leading role in NATO's establishment. Canadian soldiers have actively served as members of NATO forces from 1955 until 1993 at the conclusion of the Cold War. The arrow on the map points to an area where I served as a member of NATO in West Germany. The Gaza Strip. And I'll just read this paragraph talking about the formation of United Nations peacekeeping. The formation of United Nations peacekeeping was brought about when Canada's Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson convinced the world that its first internationally recognized peacekeeping force was necessary to resolve the crisis at the Suez Canal. Canadian soldiers were part of the United Nations emergency force that served on the Gaza Strip to police the international frontier between Israel and the Gaza Strip. And here you see the international frontier, the arrow pointing to the frontier between Egypt and Israel, and of course Gaza is highlighted up here, the Gaza Strip. After 11 years of peacekeeping, we were forced to withdraw on orders from the United Nations headquarters in New York at the request of the Egyptian president. One of my best friends was killed on the Gaza Strip. He was 21 years old. He's buried in the Gaza cemetery now with 24 other Canadians who lost their lives on the Gaza Strip and during patrols on the international frontier. Here's Mr. Pearson with his Nobel Peace Prize. Remarkable achievement indeed. Canadian soldiers have served on many Middle Eastern conflicts areas of conflict, including the Golan Heights and the Sinai Desert. And you can see the arrows pointing to the Golan Heights, the United Nations Emergency Force 2 that took place between 73 and 79, and of course, the tip of the Sinai Desert at Sharm el-Sheikh. Cyprus was another trouble spot. And I'll just read this paragraph quickly. Cyprus was another trouble spot in the Mediterranean where Canadian soldiers served as peacekeepers. The big trouble came in 1974 when the Turks invaded, during which several Canadian soldiers were killed. The Green Line still exists across the border, or across the island of Cyprus, and the island is still divided. The conflict in the Congo, formerly Zaire, was particularly difficult. Canadian soldiers were kidnapped on several occasions and held to ransom by extremists. International peacekeepers serve in that troubled country to this day. Fortunately, no Canadians have since 1964. The Congo is still in a state of chaos. Here's a typical illustration of a Canadian soldier from the Royal 22nd Regiment checking a recoilless rifle during a visit to a Congolese defensive position in 1963. The conflict in the former Yugoslavia was a brutal scar on any discussion of United Nations peacekeeping, where we failed to protect civilians during the course of these conflicts in Srebrenica in Bosnia and in the Medak Pocket in Croatia. The first arrow here shows Srebrenica, where 8,000 Muslim men and boys were massacred by Bosnian Serbs in Srebrenica, and it could have been prevented. UN peacekeepers stood by helplessly, waiting for reinforcements that never came. The United Nations promised to retain the area as a safe haven. In this slide, we see an area illustrating the Medak Pocket. In the Medak Pocket in Croatia, the PPCLI came under fire from Croatian forces, and as a result were unable to prevent the resulting ethnic cleansing. And here we see an arrow pointing to that area where the battle took place. A stronger force with the United Nations mandate authorizing an offensive operation might have prevented the slaughter of hundreds of civilians, because that was the purpose of the battle. Our soldiers were attacked to pin them down while other people were running around the country, terrorists running around the country, slaughtering helpless civilians. It was a terrible situation. And here we see an illustration of typical military police preparing for patrols in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Rwanda, 1994. This was a terrible, terrible situation. 450 peacekeepers led by Canada's General Dallaire could not prevent the slaughter of 800,000 Tutsis by Hutu extremists in 1994. The general desperately contacted United Nations headquarters, and they would not provide the forces necessary to disarm these people, to disarm the extremists. In the meantime, they were slaughtered, 800,000 Tutsis. Here we see General Dallaire, and General Dallaire, as a result of his situation in Rwanda, he suffers today, severely suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, about the post-traumatic stress disorder and why it affects so many of our veterans. It's a terrible, terrible problem. Israel and Lebanon. During the 2006 war between Hezbollah terrorists and Israel, politicians around the world were demanding the insertion of a peacekeeping force. There was one already there. We had had a peacekeeping force between northern Israel and southern Lebanon since 1978. In fact, Resolution 1559, calling for the disbanding of all Lebanese militia, including Hezbollah, was never implemented. So the United Nations failed in its requirements to prevent severe problems between civilians between Lebanon and Israel. Afghanistan is another story of our successful service. Our soldiers served in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014, and of course, during that conflict, we lost 148 of our finest, 148 of our young men and women. United Nations peacekeeping, the myth and the reality. I'm not going to read the slide itself. You can review that yourself, but I want to talk a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder, and I want to explain the serious problem of post-traumatic stress disorder. And what I'd like you to do is imagine. Imagine that you are a Canadian soldier sent on a peacekeeping mission in a faraway land like Bosnia or Rwanda. Imagine that you have just witnessed the slaughter of a helpless civilian by an extremist with a machete. And this happened in Rwanda. Civilians were slaughtered with machetes. Your instinctive reaction would be shock, then anger, and finally the realization that because we had no ability to intervene because of the United Nations mission mandate prevented us from intervening, you have just witnessed a murder that you couldn't do anything about. A soldier, a Lieutenant Ryerson in the First World War said, "War is a season of intense discomfort punctuated by periods of agonizing fear." I never came under fire during my 15-year military career, but I can imagine what that man was describing. This stressful fear experienced by many soldiers during battle manifested itself in many ways. During World War I, the term used was shell shock, where an otherwise brave soldier might literally begin to cower in terror at the mere sight of the enemy or the sound of an exploding shell. During World War II and the Korean conflict, the condition was referred to as battle fatigue, where after prolonged stress in battle, soldiers quite literally lost their sanity, became paralyzed, or began to shake or weep uncontrollably. Some simply became terrified at just the sight of an enemy uniform or a rifle. Many Canadian soldiers who suffered extreme battle stress returned to Canada, where they were placed in veterans' hospitals, never to leave, because at the time a full understanding of shell shock or battle fatigue or battle stress was not fully understood. In fact, even today, post-traumatic stress disorder is not fully understood. There are lots of theories, but not fully understood. One such soldier was Private George Leugner, one of my second cousins. I've never met the man. He was much older than I and served in the Second World War. He was placed in a veterans hospital in London, Ontario in 1945 when he returned from the front. He never left that hospital. He died there in 1997. He was suffering, obviously, a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder. Another problem today that the United Nations has not resolved, because they need peacekeepers and they're sending them around the country to various conflict areas, they are now accepting third world countries to send their soldiers as peacekeepers as a source of income that's paid by the United Nations because they cannot themselves properly support or equip their soldiers. Often these UN soldiers, because they are from third world countries, have less respect for humanity than the citizens they are supposed to protect. In the Congo, for example, and this is going on today, this is happening today, warring factions have raped thousands of women in the Congo, and those women, shunned by their families, are living in very, very difficult circumstances. Lest we forget our losses. Here are our losses. I'll just review a couple of numbers. At the top, 61,332 casualties in World War I. The Second World War, 44,893. We've talked about some of these things. We've shown you some of the veterans who returned home. Peacekeeping itself, we lost 170 soldiers in all of the peacekeeping activities that we've participated in around the world. Canadian soldiers have been honored for their exploits with many medals and awards, among them the Victoria Cross, the most prestigious of military honors. Between 1854 and 1945, 95 Victoria Crosses have been awarded to Canadian soldiers. One of the first was Nova Scotia-born William Hall, who received his award on the 25th of October, 1859. He was the first black to receive the Victoria Cross. Canadians have won a total of 95 VCs between 1854 and 45, 2 of which were won at Dieppe, 4 of which were won at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Canadian veterans, particularly those who fought in World War II and Korea, and whom I call the greatest generation, are dying at the rate of approximately 50 every day. So we're losing our old soldiers at a pretty rapid rate. Here we have the War Memorial in Ottawa, and of course the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. People who visit Ottawa must visit these sites. They must visit these sites to get an idea of what our soldiers have accomplished in 153 years. Here's another view of those 2 sites, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, right in front of the War Memorial. And here we have a close-up view of the soldiers on the War Memorial itself. The reason we're here today is to remember the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It was originally called Armistice Day to commemorate the agreement that ended the First World War. However, when you're thinking of soldiers and veterans who have died and veterans who have served, remember the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Some people say when they're at the cenotaph or when they're at the Legion, they say, we'll take a moment's silence. That's wrong. 2 minutes of silence is what's required. 2 minutes of silence is what is required to remember our soldiers who have suffered and died throughout the wars that we have fought. This is a very special poem, in Flanders Fields. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with those who die, with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. Our Parliament buildings in Canada, with, of course, the marching bands commemorating Remembrance Day. And here's Canada's flag and our anthem. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for permitting me to present this information on our veterans and the importance of our veterans and the importance of their help to help us retain freedom and democracy in Canada. On behalf of veterans themselves, I want to thank the AGAT Foundation for permitting me and allowing me to make this presentation. The next thing I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about veterans themselves and how much we need their help. We commemorate the poppies every Remembrance Day, but that's not enough. We want you to remember what the meaning of the poppy is. The poppy means supporting our veterans. And what would it encourage you to do? And we're serious about this. On behalf of veterans everywhere across the country, I'm asking you to support our veterans, in particular those veterans who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. There are thousands of them across the country who are struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. So what we'd like you to do is remember the importance of the poppy, why we remember the poppy, why it's so important to wear the poppy throughout the month of November. So send your money, whatever you can afford, $5, $10, $5,000 if you have it, and send it to the website www.legion.ca. We will be most appreciative. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.